Thank you. Morning, everyone. I'm Andy Haldane. I'm Permanent Secretary for Levelling Up at the Cabinet Office. I'm also an economic forecaster. And for the astrologists in the room, I'm a Leo. Let me immediately go off script a bit and to tell you what I'm feeling rather than what I'm thinking. And what I'm feeling is joy, actually. Joy to be here in person with other people in Sheffield. Quite unusual for an economist, former central banker, to feel joy. Typically, our stock in trade is misery. But today it really is a sense of joy, and I can feel the passion in the room for this great project. So let me start by thanking those that have brought people in this room together, which is Paul, it's Colin, it's Dave, it's Dan, it's Lucy, and others more besides supporting. Thank you. If anyone can reset South Yorkshire, it's the people in this room. And when better to start that reset than today? In fact, I've told the organisers to lock the room. No one's leaving till we've done it. So strap in. Like I imagine everyone in this room, I am fully invested emotionally in the success of Sheffield, of the region. I spent 3 years here in the city as a student way back in the 80s. That's how old I am. And the good news is that some very good progress has, of course, been made, much as I miss paying 5p for a bus ride. Remember that? Sheffield city centre is unrecognisably better than it was back then. And there are fantastic clusters of innovation and activity all over the place, which Lucy and Dan have set out brilliantly in their thoughts. But I'm sure we can probably all agree that the region is not yet operating anywhere near its full potential. These clusters I mentioned, they need expanding and they need coalescing, turning those atomistic clusters into, if you like, a supercluster, a South Yorkshire supercluster. Because over the period since the 1980s, Sheffield, in truth, has not grown as fast as many of its similarly sized northern near neighbours, Leeds and Manchester certainly, Liverpool and Newcastle as well, nor has the region always grown as fast as some of its neighbours either. As recently as the start of the century, levels of gross weekly pay were very similar in Leeds, in Sheffield, in Newcastle, just a touch higher across the Pennines in Manchester. Over the period since, that gap, Leeds and Manchester and Newcastle have moved clear. That gap has widened over time. Over the past few years, that average pay gap would be around 50 quid a week, which might not sound a lot, but the average family facing a cost of living crisis is really quite a lot. And I apologise, Kaz. I fear I may be the stats bloke today. There are more to come. And what's true of pay is true equally of productivity if you compare it across the cities, the great cities that I've mentioned. Now, that relative underperformance is in some respects, I think, pretty surprising, given the region's rich endowments, many of which will be mentioned this morning. Its incredible industrial heritage as one of the homes of the Industrial Revolution. Its sporting institutions, football clubs that are doing well in their respective leagues, even if none of them are the Premiership at the moment. Its rich cultural institutions. Sheffield's home to the largest concentration of theatres outside of London. Its fantastic green spaces, including, of course, the Peak District. Its connectivity, road, rail, air. Its fantastic universities. And Kuhn and Chris are both, of course, here. We'll hear more from them later on. Its strong local leadership, to my left, to my right, and indeed front and center here as well. That fertile pipeline of innovative companies that I've heard about already this morning, we'll hear more about during the course of today. The Boeings, the McLarens, the AMRC, the Olympic Legacy Park, the National Center for Food Engineering, the list goes on. Each and every one important clusters of innovation and of activity. So what then are the missing ingredients? Why is it then the region hasn't yet fully met that huge potential I mentioned just a second ago? Why haven't we been able thus far to turn those clusters into super clusters? So we touch on one fact, one among a many, what could be a long list. I think it's crucial to get right and to get straight. And that's the need to go much further and indeed much faster in boosting the dynamism and the scale of businesses in the region. This dynamism is the absolute bedrock of pay and productivity, and therefore the keystone for success when it comes to levelling up not just South Yorkshire, but each and every part of the UK. Now, on dynamism, Dan and Lucy have spoken about the great examples, and they are great examples, many in this room, of innovation on the ground. When I go to somewhere like the AMRC, I continue to be bowled over at how they are pushing the frontiers of technology, innovation, and best practice. Nonetheless, the overall picture, business and productivity-wise, is more nuanced. Just over a decade ago, startups per head of population were very similar in Sheffield, in Manchester, in Leeds, in Liverpool. Fast forward to today, and they're around 25% higher in Leeds, Liverpool, and 50% higher in Manchester than in Sheffield, whose startups of the same period have flatlined in numbers. So while Sheffield rightly boasts, I think around 20,000 SMEs, the wellspring of jobs and innovation and productivity, other regions have upped their game and are upped it by more over the same period. Perhaps most significantly of all, too few of those SMEs have gone from startup to scale up. They've either stalled or perished in what's sometimes called the valley of death. That tricky transition, hazardous transition from small to medium to large. That's a very British problem, by the way, but it's one that the South Yorkshire region suffers from to a disproportionate extent. That's why there are relatively fewer large anchor companies in the region compared to elsewhere, the equivalent of Nissan in Tyne and Wear, or Rolls-Royce in Derby, or Boots in Nottingham. We know from the evidence, from people like Phil, that these anchor companies are crucial for driving up regional skills, investment, innovation, and productivity. And that occurs not just because of the actions of those entities, but crucially, their knock-on effects across their supply chain and their communities. So it's been estimated that for every one job created in an innovative industry, a further 5 or 6 flow from that in industries servicing that new cluster. So why have too many companies in the region stalled on their route through from S and M to become large? And what would it take to accelerate their progress and turn those clusters into genuine superclusters? Well, my sense is that there are barriers to break down on both the company and on the finance side. For example, companies sometimes have shown a reticence about taking on that extra risk necessary to achieve scale and scope. When it comes to finance, that funding gap, what a century ago was first called the Macmillan gap, is still with us a century on in the provision of bank loans VC and angel finance, particularly in this region. And then intermediating between the two when it comes to professional and financial services, enabling those investable company propositions to be financed at scale. That aspect of business is also, I think, insufficiently developed in the region. Sheffield has around half the number of people working in knowledge-intensive private sector jobs as Leeds, just a few miles, as you know, up the M1. In the next panel, we will explore that finance side of things with Ian and others. The one thing I think we can say with complete confidence is that achieving this transition from cluster to supercluster will need to draw on the combined efforts of local leaders, local businesses, local education institutions, local community groups, as well as, of course, central government, working together in partnership in the way that Lucy just described. That is the model. That is the model that's worked elsewhere across the UK, elsewhere internationally. It's the only model that's worked everywhere, and it needs now replicating across the region. I think the good news there is that the building blocks of that are now coming together. Dan and Lucy have mentioned some of those initiatives, and let me mention one or two more myself as I close. And just starting on the central government side, we announced in the white paper just over a month ago. By the way, I assume that everyone's read all 375 pages of that. I shall be testing you during the course of today, during the coffee breaks. Among the initiatives in there, it includes Sheffield being chosen as one of the first two places identified to undertake a high quality, very ambitious regeneration program, transforming derelict urban sites into new and innovative communities. It includes the designation of Rotherham and Doncaster as two of the new education investment areas to help make good on the white paper mission of effectively ending illiteracy and innumeracy across the UK. It includes £570 million for the city region sustainable transport settlements. It includes the region's share of the 2.6 billion shared prosperity fund, which, Dan, in future, it will be in your hands to use as you see fit. Much more flexibility and localism than was possible under the former EU structural funds. The perspective on this, setting this out in beautiful detail, will come courtesy of Emran in a few weeks' time. And of course, these initiatives are important in their own right. But to Lucy's point from a minute ago, their real significance, their real power, the real potency comes from what they do to crowd in private finance and private business. Else you are, through levelling up, pushing water uphill, which tends to be a tricky thing to do. And just to give you one example of that, in the white paper, we asked every local government pension system to come up with a plan of how they might allocate 5%, just 5% of their monies towards funding local businesses, funding local projects. And if you take that existing pot of money, which in South Yorkshire is about 10 billion quid, that would translate into almost £500 million of money that could be put to use for local projects. Please form an orderly queue after this presentation for those monies. Now, Dan makes a very good point when he points to the proliferation of government funding pots, each with their own often tricky T's and C's. Dan, one of my first asks when I went into government a few months ago was to ask someone to go away and to count the number of central government funding pots. And one exhausted research assistant in an Excel spreadsheet later, they stopped around 139 different pots, each with their own beautiful nuance. Now, just to be candid, Dan, that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It makes no sense for you administering. It makes no sense for us dishing it out. It's inefficient for both of us, and it will stop. So we committed in the white paper to streamline, to simplify, to lengthen the duration of those pots, exactly as Dan has set out, so that we can unleash that latent energy locally. I think in your words, Dan, allow local areas to get on and spend as they think appropriate to meet their local needs. Turning locally, these central government initiatives will only work if they go with the grain of the region's own plan, the strategic economic plan from last year, which I was delighted to see was put in place. It's a really good plan. I was also delighted to hear this morning from Lucy about the creation of the South Yorkshire Innovation Board, providing that leadership in driving forward innovation, startup to scale up, commercialization, but also, Lucy, bring together all those partners needed to make a success of things. Looking ahead, we are creating these things called leveling up directors. And I hope they will be able to contribute importantly to this innovation board, Lucy, serving as the key pivot point, the key intermediary between the central government machine and what is happening locally. Let me close with this local economic strategy in place, with the local anchor institutions, new and old, in place, with a fresh wave of financing, both public and private, in place. We'll hear more about that in a second. And with the drive of the people, the leaders, actually, in this room, I think there's every chance we can lift and shift expectations in the region. Indeed, forge a new narrative for South Yorkshire. Because, Cats, I'm not just the stats guy, I'm the stories guy as well. And one thing we can do in the room today, as the work of Paul and David Tuckett have shown, is to create that uplifting new narrative. And if we do that today and the days after today, we can, I think, reset. We can move from cluster to supercluster. And as someone like you, who remain fully emotionally invested in the region, I look forward to building the region in the years ahead, including from successes down to this summit. I can confidently predict, in my capacity as super economic forecaster, we will at future summits not just be talking about, but celebrating South Yorkshire's success. Thank you, everyone, for listening.